So this is Valerie Peck, CEO of SuiteCX, and Julie St. John, who you've also met, who is one of our technologists as well as coaches. And what we're going to go over today is something a little bit different. So rather than focus on the buttons and how to make maps work and from a very functional viewpoint, what we're going to talk about today is some approaches to experience and journey mapping. So the reason that we do this class is that it's really important to get context around why you're mapping, and just like any other type of research, you want to be able to essentially query that research so that you can use it for different purposes. I was just at NextGen 2017 for a couple of days, and there's kind of this common idea that you do a journey map and you put this immense amount of effort into it. You collect all your customer insights, a lot of emotional data, all of the work that we do, yet it still ends up now a digital poster. So what this talks about is different ways that people either approach problem solving or opportunity analysis using that same data that you've collected to do a broader customer experience map where you're looking at general outcomes that affect acquisition, retention, and growth. So I'd love for you all to ask questions as we go through each of these. It's going to be heavy in case studies and examples. So I've got the tool open, so we've got a couple of other examples that we can throw in here around getting to a level of granularity that starts helping other things like UX and employee experience rather than, again, just having it for a single use. So what we're going to cover here is, over the years in our consultancy and in the software company, we've had a lot of reasons to map different things. And so a lot of times people, again, think that this approach is just a one-size-fits-all one approach. And so what we're going to talk about is the different business aspects you can address using journey mapping, different outputs that you can get from journey mapping, approaches to mapping with some example case studies, and then skills and tools that you need for the work. Customer journey mapping often can provide information to solve a lot of different kinds of business problems. So typically, this is the type of business problem that people need to resolve somehow. We see a lot of people come to us saying that we've had a decline of revenue. We see sales going down, we see volume going down, we see churn going up. Retention is always a problem if it's not continuously nurtured. Competitive inroads is a real problem nowadays with a lot of different disruptive marketing techniques. So identifying reasons for unknown revenue declines and economic challenges such as recession are also really typical. So, when times are really good and people have a little bit of money, they tend to look at white space analysis, and then things tighten up, then they look at retention and management. So it's our opinion that you should be doing that continuously, but businesses are businesses, and the teams don't have that much time. All of you have been cut down since 2008, and it just doesn't seem that people have staffed back up again. So kind of having a hedge against that is really important. So they know that they have specific experience issues. There's a lot of great new research coming around that addresses Net Promoter Score. So Net Promoter Score is a lagging indicator. And so it's really interesting, but it's sort of the horse is out of the barn already. If you've got a negative NPS, you need to understand why you have that NPS. Same for CSAT. Both of those are lagging indicators, and what you're not necessarily seeing is either a predictive map that says this is where our problems are going to occur because of things that we're doing in our operations or things that we're trying to do that are new, that are standing up new environments, things like that. And it doesn't actually show you things like the moments of truth that are creating the Net Promoter Score. So people who rely on that solely often are blindsided because something's going to be happening upstream and they don't see it until after it's happened. Complaint increases are a very interesting thing because, again, as you're moving through uh, the customer's continuum, if they're not getting their mission met, they're going to tend to increase their complaints, and those complaints might not necessarily be where they actually had the pain. So that's also a little bit of a thorny thing. So looking at some of these will be really helpful. And then, if you position yourself in this customer experience center of excellence that you have, or even a consulting team, helping your C-levels understand the entire sales, marketing, service continuum where you're requesting funds is really, really helpful to use visualization to bring it to life. And I'll use a couple of examples of that where finally they were able to break through by visualizing something for executives. It also can be used for many strategic purposes. So understanding existing customer behavior across the entire experience and life cycle is a great input to strategic planning. We have a number of examples, and I'll give you one case study coming up, where people looked at getting into a new market and made a decision based on some competitive insights and understanding the target persona that they were going after to understand whether or not they had the capability to provide the brand promise that they were expected to do when to have it live up to the rest of their brand. And they decided at that point that they couldn't enter this new market because they weren't going to be up to their brand promise. So understanding the science of your customer insight and starting to do disciplined data management and analytics is really important. So what we also find is as people move away from wall art into a more digital experience, just like running a database or a content management system, there's an added opportunity to add a layer of depth to what you're doing that is much better than, again, trying to put everything on a two-dimensional map. Developing a 360 customer view. This was kind of interesting. We did a roundtable down at NextGen, and all of the information that you're pulling in from people like Opinion Lab or 4C or Google Analytics or Thunderhead or Eloqua is really great. I saw a real tendency for people to focus on both digital and analytics and less emotion, which was kind of interesting. So making sure that you've got that fault line between rational and irrational behavior mapped is really important because, as you well know, we're feeling creatures who can think. And oftentimes, sometimes I don't think we're thinking at all. So you also can drive better strategic opportunities and look at ROI. So you can use the tool to start looking at that, and we'll show you that in a moment as well. So some of the outputs and use cases that we find are most common, and again, these are not all of them. We talked a little bit about strategic planning, understanding customer insights to understand what to invest in, what to divest in, because at some point you might not be able to meet customer needs in a certain area or might not choose to because they're not profitable to actually serve up the customer's mission the way that they want it. So in order to protect your brand, you need to stop doing some things. And I've seen a lot of automotive customers start looking at that and understanding when they need to not market to a particular group or not support a particular group because they can't possibly service them. New product development. Now this is a very interesting place to look at using this type of mapping, and I'll call it linear mapping, because you can actually see the white space so that you can understand your audience's need. There's a few ways of doing it. You can map the competitors if it's an existing product offering and you're trying to decide whether or not you want to go into it. If you map best in class and average table stakes, you will now know exactly where you need to be in your functionality to meet that customer's need. If you're disruptive and you want to actually map out what the experience expectation is, that's also a really great way to start building your company, so you build to that expectation of what the customer needs, which oftentimes, especially in high tech, is something that's a gap. Any engineering type companies that have a heavy product focus have a really hard time building the customer inside. So what happens is they build something really keen, and then they expect sales and marketing to figure out how to bolt on what the customer mission should have been. So having that customer mission really clearly articulated is really helpful. Tactical thrusts is where, again, a lot of people forget the fact that they did all this work around a particular area, so that, if they're having a retention problem, or they're having a problem when a company is taking delivery of a vehicle, that's a really complex thing where there's lots of departments involved. In fact, if you wanted to do a little improvement project now, just go look at the life cycle elements where you have more than 3 of your departments involved. Oftentimes, those are the little handoff places between sales and marketing, marketing and service, implementation and service. And when you get a lot of different departments involved, or when you have a lot of channels, because web and social tend to be these kind of spun out little groups that are silos, that's really the fault line again, where a lot of customer experience is coming in that isn't managed or optimized. For UX inputs, so UX is increasingly important as we go more digital, more mobile, more social. And so really getting the insights from voice of the customer and voice of the employee, and understanding those little moments of truth that may be slightly different depending on the channel and the presentation of that channel, is really important when you're doing UX design. In fact, we just did something for ourselves because we're doing a little UX review, and we found that using our own tool was really helpful. And then finally, campaign marketing, precision marketing. One of the things that, again, we've seen over the last 20 years is that many companies don't do the really hard homework that you have to do to get inside your customer's brain in order to do truly differentiated marketing. So you don't even need to be one-to-one, even though a lot of digital platforms allow that. We partner with Kitewheel and Eloqua and a few others. And the reality is if you really don't understand the value proposition and the differentiated imagery and messaging that you need to have for each of your different segments as you market to them, you're not going to be as effective. So that's a pretty logical step. A lot of people understand the step between doing a journey map and either doing a communications plan or a campaign, but that's generally where the biggest ROI comes in. So what is journey mapping? You've probably been through this already in our first 100 class, but I want to just urge you to think about a couple of things. So one of them is where the customer meets the brand and the brand touches the customer. So those don't necessarily come at the same time. The customer may be touching the brand in a lot of ways in social media, in search, in discussing things with friends, and you never know that they're actually doing it. So you have to have a pretty good idea of the information that you want out there so that you can enable that type of thing. When the brand touches the customer is the most common thing that people are mapping, interested in mapping, focused on, and frankly, it's the one that's the most nurtured and curated. Where the brands are touching the customer are mostly outbound, and that's the most expensive way to interact with your customer. So it's generally highly planned, it's highly treated, it's analyzed. And the other side, where the customer is touching the brand and you don't know it, whether it be planned or unplanned, meaning I've got search or I'm doing some kind of emotional brand advertising, that's less controlled. And then the most that's, again, that where we find the most problems are unplanned communications. So as you go through this, the multiple interaction points with the brand are the journey. And one of the things we've also found a quick insight there as well is stepping outside and really understanding the customer's mission is something very difficult for companies. I'd say 85, 90% of companies that come to us where we train hand us their campaign plan or what they think their communication stream is and say, okay, we've done this, we've done our net promoter score, we're done. And there's so much more, because you have to really understand why the customer is seeking contact with the brand and what their mission is, and then how you're going to help achieve it. Couple of terminology elements. Again, an experience is the sum of what the customer takes away from the interactions. It's a memorable event with a beginning, middle, and end. They always have an experience. So it could be good, it could be bad, or it could be indifferent. If it's either bad or indifferent, you're at high risk anymore of getting poached. So you really do need to understand as you're going through, putting yourself into your customer's shoes. So interactions. So there's a lot of discussion about, an interaction. Generally, people think it's purely a touch, and a touch is something that happens on a channel. So, a business supports dozens, if not hundreds, of interactions. And again, many of them kind of fall into some softer edges, either consumer decision modeling or click-through streams and things like that. So we'll get it. I think that Julie talked a little bit in one of the classes about an interaction and, the fact that it is a beginning, middle, and end. What we're going to talk about a little bit more here is scenario planning around the entire stream of interactions. And then engagement points. They can be inbound, outbound, or interactive, human, or automated. So that's the fault line between the customer and the company. And actually, I'll show you a little example of that, if you don't mind. So this is a really good example of a little bit of a drill down in customer experience. And I'm calling this fault line the emotional line right here, that shows whether or not the customer is happy, satisfied, or angry. And this particular visual here is, we're all going to the airport. It happens, you get that text that says your flight's canceled. You roll into the airport, and there you go. There's an incredibly long line. There's no kiosks open. And so what do you do next? You dial that phone if you're not a millennial, and you get on hold. And, because there's a huge problem, everybody's on hold as well. Some of them in line aren't as smart as you with getting on hold. And then because you're on hold or you're a millennial, you get on the mobile app. So now what am I doing in this experience? First of all, as a customer, I'm really annoyed, because I'm just annoyed. It's early in the morning, and darn it, can't they keep snowstorms from happening? And rather than being proactive, this particular airline, of course, doesn't necessarily look at all its best customers and automatically reroute them and send them a message saying, we've put you on these 1 or 2 flights, click the one you want, which is a very effective and positive way of dealing with disruption. But this one is just waiting for people to call. So not only am I using one channel, I am working on all 3 channels right now, and that's a really expensive proposition for the airline. So if you think of this from a customer mission, and you think of it from the company mission, is I want to serve this customer at the most cost-effective point and satisfy them while I'm doing that. So looking at the process of what's going on in a drill down here, and then looking at some of the data that's coming in. Now, this particular one is a call center focused map, where I just said, let's see what's happening in our call center, because our call center is actually managing our chat as well as our phone. So it's multitasking in this particular story. And I'm looking at the data here around peak times. I'm looking at my net promoter score in general time lanes, because they can pull it in by lifecycle time frame. I'm looking at my first call resolution and my overflow and my escalations here from a data perspective. So I'm stepping back and saying, This happens to us every single day somewhere. How do we optimize it? So looking at this data as we drill down with the scenario gives you the ability to start, again, drilling into issues and coming up with answers to problems when you actually look at the customer's mission, and it allows you to do some innovation. Making a good journey map isn't just looking at the life cycle over and over again. It does involve that type of change in the way that you want to change your behavior. One of the things that you really want to make sure you know is that it's a living document. So the reason that we moved into the digital world here is because if a PowerPoint or a beautiful Adobe map was good enough, that's where we would have stopped. But making it three-dimensional uh, is really important. So it's also art meets science with a dash of chemistry. At a level of detail that makes sense for the purpose. So you saw there a much more detailed view than sometimes people are used to. So one of the really interesting things we found out, and I actually found this out in doing some interviews with the Forrester team, because they were looking at a slightly different view. They wanted to discuss, when do you use Agile maps and when do you use deep dives? And we'll get into that in a minute. But it made me realize as I was going through here that our team has been doing mapping since, 1999. So we don't think about some of this stuff. We just meet a client, and we kind of evaluate them. And if you're looking at someone who's really smart, like one of the teams that we have from Epsilon, they really understand the concept of mapping. They don't need to learn a lot of how to from that. But as you go into a client, that decision of what kind of map do I do for this client depends. And it has a lot more to do with the personality of a company than it does anything else, which again, absolutely tracks with all of the things we say around getting inside the customer's head. But companies who really have a lot of detail and rigor in their approaches to strategy, they're technology driven and very execution driven, tend to do more rigorous mapping. Many of them have a Six Sigma DNA. They have an approach that collects all of their interactions, and they want to really collect all the data around them, and they want to flesh out pain points and moments of truth. And once they've gotten all of that data in, and they tend to start out with a grid and swim lane look and view. And once they do all of this, they have really clear questions of their hypothesis, and they want clear outcomes. Eventually they may get to some story, but they are really analytically driven. And that tends to be telecoms, financial, insurance, B2B manufacturers. These are the folks that fall into this group because they've got this massive data and they want to use it. And then there's the other side that are more brand driven or emotional. And they tend to have like agency driven personas. They oftentimes have some really great videos of their target persona and his or her process as they go through a particular life cycle. And they really want to visualize something quickly and identify areas of interest. They may have some data around things, but data is usually a different department. And they're into ideation and innovation, a lot of ethnographic research, and they often have to back up and pull in data to keep moving forward. Their outcomes generally aren't as clearly articulated, and they really like workshops and fast answers. So this is the team that does Agile mapping and kind of stops. And this tends to be consumer product groups, pharmaceuticals, and startups. In order to be able to do this type of work, and again, we're video this, spit it out, videotaping this, so we could send this to you as well as the deck. We've put together a very typical customer journey mapping plan that you've probably seen, so I won't dwell on it. But understanding current state, moving into collection of data, and then getting to recommendations is a pretty typical function you can take as short as a 3-day workshop or as long as 4 months to do this. What we find in the approach, again, is there's a lot of different ways in. If you're taking the softer way in and you're doing Agile mapping, at some point you want to stand back and make sure that you're collecting data. And if you're taking a very pain or predictive type of objective approach and you're pulling it in, you want to not forget the emotion.
Valerie, quick question. Yeah, with regard to your the approach to journey mapping, I mean, this I guess you can do it at the high level, and I really appreciate you kind of sharing this notion of the customer touching the brand and where the brand touches the customer, right? And focusing in on those customer touches and intersections with the brand on those less planned moments, and then completely those unplanned moments. Not all customers with a brand are the same, right? We often have segments that exist. We often have, very finely defined subsegments, right? Where do you recommend, what's your point of view or take on at what level you map to be most effective? And is there a set approach in doing sort of that master map and then kind of breaking it down into smaller pieces, or do you start with the component pieces and then add those, leverage those up and add those up to be the master brand?
Yeah.
What's your kind of perspective on that?
So we if we have our druthers and you're going to be working for, a long-term type of approach, we like to collect as much. I like to collect as much information, and then we love segments. Segments are real. Personas are descriptions of segments. So if you have a persona, it's okay. But as you say, depending on the need. So if you're just trying to lay something down to get a lay of the land, it's okay to do a high-level map that covers all of the individuals that relate to your brand. So if you think of doing a statement of intent on your brand, and then pick it apart. So you start picking it apart of what's different with Molly Millennial versus Samantha Senior. What's different between Jack and Jill Wealth Builder, who are casual interaction folks with your brand, versus somebody like Robbie Wright Stuff in a banking environment who's in every single day. So the more granular you can get in collecting the information as you start collecting your basis, then the mapping can be done at the level that's appropriate for the things you're trying to achieve. So I know that sounds like a mushy statement, but it kind of depends on how much time you have. If you don't have a lot of time, then you should be as specific as possible to the target audience that you are addressing to map that exact group so that you can get the answer you need. If you have a little more time, or you're going to strategically start, again, because you're going to collect information over time, then getting a bigger view and drilling in gives you a better idea of where your pain points really are. That answer your question?
Yeah, it's that I was afraid that it was going to be that whole "it depends" answer, which it sounds
I'm sorry. Well, it doesn't. Let me go through a couple of these examples, and I'll show you why. Because again, if you're trying to resolve, if you know where your pain point is, you can drive right in and do that map that I showed you on the example there, and you could use one element of one life cycle with one persona, and you could get really, really deep. Now, you don't want to lose that. You want to just put that in the inventory of information. But if you're looking at a company with a general malaise, I'll use retail as an example because there's a lot of that out there. You've got a lot of data around the general customer, and Anne, thank you, and who your best customer is, Anne says, you can say, let's map our best customer. Or even more interestingly, let's map our best customer of 5 years ago and map our best customer now. And is it really what we're doing that's changed our best customer, which has changed our model? So we started going into couponing, and we now only trap coupon people. And now we're in this death spiral if we don't offer a coupon. our customer won't come back versus 5 years ago, we actually had full service and we got the customers who were spending more money.
Yeah, so I guess but hearing your examples, I mean, that certainly helps. And it sounds like if the objective of the exercise is really exploratory, right, to map just kind of the broad, like you said, the general customer journey and potentially have a couple of segments. I like the idea of best customer versus others, or lapsed customer, lagging versus, or if it's prescriptive where you're trying to address a specific issue or pain point, and then that can be the starting point where you would then, I could see the scale of the map would be different.
Exactly.
So I'm sure the examples will help to dimensionalize it a little bit more. So thank you very much for clarifying.
Yeah, and so I hate that it depends because that's not helpful, but it does, because again, that's the point of this kind of whole exercise that we're doing here, is that this particular use case here is they're driving to resolve some issues. So we're going to do, this is the full Monty research-based map. So you've got a pain point. What we always, again, given our druthers, when we give advice, we always say, do an inch wide do a mile wide and an inch deep, just to understand who is involved in the customer experience that you may never have thought of. And, the takeaway that I always have had now, again, from doing these for a number of years, is that one of the best things that comes out of journey mapping is a side effect. It's the fact that all of the departments that have been in silos have now started interacting with each other. And it's really goofy because, you get this group of people and you just do an initial Agile map, and the finance person looks over at the marketing person and said, I never knew that you knew that. Or, gee, I could work with this information. So just breaking down silos is huge. And again, because just in the last 5 years, we've had this rush of new channels. So we've had mobile, we've had social, we've had, 2 or 3 versions of different kinds of web or e-commerce sites. And then we have, the old tried and true brick and mortar and call center. And, if you look at the data, there's very few customers that actually start in one channel and end in the same channel without ever stepping out for any reason. So, you really do need to kind of get that big view. And then in this case, I've got an issue. This calls for an inch wide, mile deep. How do I see the pain points, the moments of truth? How do I understand how to look at front stage and backstage? If you're a company that has a field team that comes out like a Comcast or an AT&T, you have to understand what the customer is experienced with that person, and that person actually has a customer relationship with their back office. So, understanding the layers, we just had a client that was really fascinating. We added a layer in here, not just voice of the customer, voice of the employee. We actually had the layer of what the customer's experience was. So that's their mission and how they're experiencing the company, because they don't really care what department they're talking to. They want their thing either installed or fixed. Then there's the employee. The employee could be a call center. It could be a on-site technician or someone like that. And then there's the process that drives that on-site technician or that call center. And unless you drill all the way through to get to a root cause there, what happens is that poor employee is either augmenting or making the problem worse, or they're mitigating the problem because they're really smart and they know how to subvert systems. So if you're getting down here to try to figure out what a root cause is of a problem, you need to actually look all the way down through this. And again, that's where mapping really helps, because anybody who's doing any type of UX or process work can quickly apply that and layer it in. So that's exactly what we recommend here, is you start pinpointing the gaps and overlaps, and it gets you a really specific set of findings at a very granular level. And, it allows you to put in a lot of data. So this particular example is a client that they had literally, they've been growing at triple digits, and they suddenly had a decrease in their revenue and in their retention. They didn't look really far into it. They know they had a problem, and actually the CFO and the marketing team were both great. They were closely aligned. They said, we need to figure this out. So they called us in and said, what do you suggest we do? And I said, the first thing is, have you looked at your data yet? And they said, well, no, we hadn't thought of that. So we pulled their data, and they had a sales tool and a patient tool. They didn't have anything in the middle, to keep nurturing. So I put that as a note of that's going to be a problem. But, we did a little bit of a voice of the customer, a voice of the employee, and then we journey mapped them. And at the same time, we did a data analysis, and they had plenty of data to tell us who their best customers were, what segments those customers were in, what they were doing from a revenue perspective and an appointment perspective. And, we were immediately able to drill right into the place in the life cycle where they were having the most trouble. And that was during, everything went swimmingly until they converted to be a patient. And then they became a patient, and their two best segments dropped off at weeks 5 and week 7 kind of repeatedly. Some of them came back, some of them didn't. And so we actually mapped that exact process, which is what you're looking here in this middle process of what worked and what didn't in that critical period of the weight loss period that created the problems that they were having. And so we got into that, and we understood what was going on. So the two best segments, one of them was working professional women, and the second best segment was entertaining couples. So the working professional women dropped off like clockwork at week 5. What was happening to those working women? They went on a trip. They hit the Marriott, 10 o'clock at night, tired, went to the concierge lounge because everybody bows because they travel a lot. Had that glass of wine, oops. Then they ordered the hamburger, and then it was downhill from there. Now, many of them, because they were disciplined, would come back in a week or a week and a half, and then they drop off again. But they weren't getting to their goal in a timely manner because they were sabotaging themselves. And the clinic wasn't recognizing that this was a little specialized segment that needed some coaching around how to deal with travel. So they implemented that. And suddenly this group sprung back, and they got through the programs, and this was one of their best referral groups, by the way, because they met so many people, and everyone was saying, my God, how do you look so great? And they said, hey, we went through this program, and suddenly their referrals came back up. And then with the entertaining couples, every 7 weeks, what do you think they were doing? Same thing. We found out that they were entertaining. So what they needed to do once they did a little bit of a drill down there of what was happening is they were a slightly different group. They were a little older. They were a little more conservative. We assigned them a coach. And that coach followed up with them and it just happened that they made sure that the week before they had an event, they did a body scan because body scans were really fun, and they showed how well they were progressing. And they were able to make it through their own party, pretty much sticking to what they needed to stick to. So by doing a real detailed drill down there, they were able to keep their clients, and there were a few other things like, calling out if they missed an appointment, giving them some podcasts. There were, just some simple changes that they had to make that essentially within 3 months of making them, they were back on track again. Very, very, it was very rewarding because, again, in this situation, it was just a few tweaks. It wasn't a huge change. So the next kind of approach here, again, is a little bit research-oriented. So you've got a big opportunity. You want to figure out how to be most successful. What are we talked about this in the beginning, what are the table stakes or benchmarks so that they know what strategic advantage is? It also works really well for competitive research. So one of the things a lot of people forget to do when they're doing any type of experience or journey mapping is go find your best competitor, or two of them, depending on what, and do a little bit of outside-in mystery shopping and research for them. It's amazing how much you can get because you're doing it anyway. I mean, when you're doing research on some type of outside in and you Google, best SUV or hippest sunglasses, you get all the competitive information while you're doing it. So mapping a little bit of competitive information helps you understand where you are vis-a-vis their experience and is very helpful when you're trying to sell it into executives, because you can say, here's what they're doing and here's what we're doing. So that's a very compelling exercise. So, when you're trying to do this, it calls for a balance. It's wide enough to see the big picture and just deep enough to flesh out key elements. So in this case, as you were saying, you don't have to go way down there into deep technology of a find and fix program. But, if you can do as much as possible with comparisons, it's really good. So again, in a research-based approach, when you're trying to get a feel of the market, this is where personas come in. So if you're targeting a particular set of prospect groups or you don't quite know who to target and you don't know them well, doing this is really important because their moments of truth, their life cycle, the friction they find in the process, all are slightly different. So if you can either pose, this is who I'm targeting, and then make the edges a little fuzzy, because sometimes you find out that there's a persona that might be as good or better for you as you're going through this. This is a really great approach. So it allows you to ID really actionable opportunities. It gives you enough depth to act upon it with others and share it, because again, this visualization helps you co-create with others. And you keep adding to this, and as you go through it, once you actually implement a new product or a new set of services or whatever, you can keep your finger on what's going on as you move forward because you've already done this research. It's also a really great way to keep your finger on competitors. So this is the example I alluded to a little bit earlier. Bank of the West is owned by BNP Paribas, and in Europe, online banking, pure online banking, never see even an ATM, is very popular, especially in places like Turkey and in Belgium. They're just as the whole host. This is pretty much what all millennials do, and there's a heavy millennial population here in the U.S. that is a great target. So the bank decided that it was going to go forward and create an all online product. So in this particular case, what we suggested that they do is do a little bit of outside research to see how high the bar was. So they had a good idea of who their biggest competitors were, both traditional competitors like Citibank and USAA, and then there also were a couple of disruptors like Simple Bank and very focused segment competitors like Everbank was in the senior section. So what we did is we did a very structured outside-in mapping exercise where we mapped all of their competitors by 4 personas. So we had Molly Millennial, Robbie Rate stuff, as I said, Jack and Jill Wealth Builders and Samantha Senior, who was their biggest base as a bank. So that's how almost all of their systems were optimized to the wealth building and boomer segments. And so we mapped all of that, and we got very deep into each life cycle from an outside-in perspective, because we had a little bit of research that we were able to do, and the bank did competitively about rates and a couple of other things that they actually thought were important that when we did the mapping and the research weren't so important. Rate wasn't, as interestingly enough, important to everyone. Frictionless experience was the most important thing to the segments. So we actually helped them then create what we call a camel. So over the right here, what it is that we said by life cycle, if you wanted to be at table stakes or best in class, 2 sets, this is what you would have to look like. You'd have to have the online search capabilities of Amex. You had to have the onboarding of Ally Bank. You had to, and we went through, and because we took little images of each of the screenshots and things, everybody was able to see what they did versus what they had to be in order to be competitive. And it was sad for us, but they made the right decision that at the point in time they were at the bank, that they weren't able to be competitive enough in this really competitive market without cannibalizing their existing customer base, so they dropped it and decided not to go forward. So this is kind of a unique approach here to looking at new product development to make sure that they just didn't leap into a new product that was going to cost them millions of dollars to find out that at some point they weren't going to be successful. Okay, now let's talk a little bit about CX and UX. What's the difference? So CX, and they're closely interlined, because again, if you look at friction, a poor UX might add a lot of friction into an interaction, but it is much more focused on how a product or a website or a mobile screen should be used, while CX is much more focused at the entire experience, and it really requires a lot of more of a business approach. So as you go through here, by having a strong CX, you then enable a strong UX. And you can use the two as you go through, just like you would a process diagram, because people kind of understand the relationship between a customer mission and then is the process that we're doing meeting that customer mission. It's the same interaction as you have when you do the customer mission of what they're trying to achieve, and then what is it that I'm serving them up to be able to achieve that. This next example here is an example of using the same process that we're using here in a very agile environment to quickly understand where you are and to meet a particular need. So if you're trying to understand, so a lot of CMOs or CEOs come in, they're 90 days on the job, they need a quick diagnostic. They're not going to spend 6 months of dedicated work to do a detailed, holistic plan. They need to figure out where the pain is fast. So doing this calls for sort of an agile approach. So it's really useful to, and we use a lot of workshops for this. So this is where your team can literally do an internal workshop around a particular idea of, we're going to just see where the glaring problems are. So this is where you start with an inch deep and a mile wide. You collect all of the communications, all of the interactions that you have today. You kind of say, okay, what can I get my hands in right now? You do a really quick outside in, so you get an idea of the huge friction spots, and essentially you can quickly map that in day one with a couple days of planning. In day one, you can create a very quick agile map that says we see problems in acquisition, retention, or growth, or all three. But hopefully there's just a small area, and then you can actually do a next dive down in the afternoon of the thing that you've discovered. And if you've got the right team in the room, meaning you've got people in IT and HR and in operations and all the channels, you can quickly drill in and see the major problems there and say, gee, this is the particular area we need to focus in tomorrow morning. The next morning, you do a next level down and you start looking a little bit more if you can get some voice of the customer information. And that gives you the information you need to do some high-level action items for validation or ongoing research. And then that comes through with the next steps of driving to either a budget or a roadmap. So this particular example was a large CPG company pulled in a brand new CRM team. And when I say CRM, it was, real relationship management versus retail database marketing. And, they needed to quickly put together a global budget for operations and technology, as well as coaching and support. And they only had about 6 weeks to do it. Whoever's idea was that was a little nuts. So they sent a whole team on a set of workshops in 5 different countries for 2 products. So the team spent 4 days on site in 5 countries, and they looked at 2 brands, and they did exactly that. They laid down a very high level experience map from each of the brands, and they looked at the as-is. They did presentations. Each brand did a presentation of their silos, essentially, because that's what they were, the social team, the web team, and many of them were in store or e-commerce. And they did a presentation of what they were doing, and we augmented the map while they were doing the presentation. And then we did a little bit of a survey of a market maturity model of what functionality they had. We had sent that out a few days ahead. And from those 2 elements, we were able to drill in on where their gaps were in performance and where their gaps were in funding. And we were then able to pull that together so that we could present, or they could present to their team, a roadmap of initiatives that was global. Now, the interesting thing that came out of this, which we didn't really expect, was the fact that they also had a bunch of really great best practices. Every country had 1 or 2 things that they were doing that were really innovative or really just functionally sound. And so we collected those, and in their budget, they made sure that they put funding in to take there were about 10 really top ones, and about half of them required a little bit of budget, and the other half didn't require any budget at all. They were just really great at marketing ideas. And when we shared them around to the rest of the teams, most of them literally just adopted a few of them immediately that gave them lift. So it was a really interesting project in that, again, by using the same methodology of a little outside-in research, a little inside-out research, and pulling that all together, you got a really great result. And then the last exercise that we'll talk about here is kind of a blended approach. Start with that bigger Agile approach where you need to see where you are and where your deeper pain points are, and then keep using the same approach, drilling in over time, start looking at what you're doing, and start using the journey mapping and customer insight approach to drive your marketing and in this case your facilities plans as you go forward. So this particular piece is, again, it's kind of a hybrid. The first thing you do, the CMO in this particular case came in, we had worked together, she called up and said, I need you, there's a board meeting in 2 months and I need to know where I am. So her team got up to speed, learned to use the software, and then they actually had some real barriers because they had 28 different companies, all with different data. So they had a couple, the reservation system was combined for about half of the data, and then they had a bunch of pieces. And so we had to work with their data team and an outsourced statistician and a few other people to get enough information to just kind of see where the biggest bones were buried. And then as part of the first things that the client recommended was to create a little center of excellence around customer experience and execution, applied customer experience. And so then they started focusing in over 3 years. They're now enjoying a 1% increase in revenue on $500 million of company in just doing the work that we did. So they've actually, because they started from the beginning, they tagged everything that they did from understanding customer experience all the way through. And so they're actually able to count for that lift that's directly applicable. So it was really good. The other thing that it did is the executives really got it. So again, when funding is asked for now, they almost always get funding to do the things they want to do next. So the approach here was really, again, a very broad voice of the customer, voice of the employee, maturity model, and then some outside-in research because, some of their properties that they were charging $500 a night for were not up to the task. And so they then looked at once they knew they didn't have the data. So the next step in year 2 was creating a 360 database. Then they bought a robust marketing automation capability and some additional social and digital capabilities. And as they went through, they started applying all of these, and then they came back and did some more experience mapping in some of the problem spots. And so they did a really great job of pulling both emotional driven experience and the data that they had. And again, their marketing strategy is now dependent on using this approach, and it's just part of essentially their budget cycle. So to your point about, personas, if you've got a persona or you have an idea of your personas, it's great. If you've got segments, even better, because again, you can immediately apply the work that's done here to that. But even if you don't, and again, every company has larger groups, and again, we call it the Molly Millennial versus Samantha Senior. You have a good idea of your target audience, and from that, you can actually start doing persona-driven maps that show you the nuances of what's going on. So if your level of sophistication is such that you're already there, you can just jump right in because it works. But if you don't have it, it's also not a problem because you can again query this broad set of opportunities, and you can drill in and do research either outside in or inside out that helps you do that. So skills and technology. So how do you bring all of this to the table? So you need some, again, we have to do our little, we have found that using technology, not just the software tool, by the way, but really understanding the data that you have and having a data-driven approach so that you've got the underlying data to support your hypotheses as well as the emotional information. So, when you look at social sentiment and you look at net promoter score or top box, bottom box, or inline services like Feedback Ferret or a number of the different, I'm just naming names here, a number of the different generic in-moment types of emotional triggered analysis and even things like word clouds. Um, having those technologies to bear actually makes your life a lot easier. It allows you to express your findings. It shortens the time to present views. It doesn't really have knowledge or experience, so you can all do all the digital clickstream tracking or conversion tracking that you want. Even at a granular level, knowing what to do with it still comes from you. Um, Sharing, collaborating, presenting information is really important, as most larger companies nowadays are not all local. So this helps you, even if you come in and do one of those Agile mapping exercises and then you all disperse again, you really do find that collaboration and co-creation are really effective. And then keeping the process alive and ongoing is really important as well. So the more, if you just think of this as a lifecycle-based customer data warehouse, you can do an immense amount with it versus thinking of it as a journey map. So, where we're moving to is helping you do scenario planning by journey type, and that journey type could be focused in on a persona, it could be focused in on a problem. There's just tons of ways that you can hypothesize that will really help with that. And then you have to have the skills. So either whether you have them in-house or you borrow or outsource or rent them, you still have to have a business mindset. So it's really fun to go off the deep end and do the total, here's the customer mission, and you can have a lot of fun with what your customers really want. But the bottom line is you're not going to get anything done unless you can convince people to put money to it. It allows you to focus on innovation because, again, this process with some brainstorming in it is a lot more flexible than just looking at a data stream. You have to have the ability to envision what the company needs and wants to achieve. And in some future sessions like this, or if you guys want to ping me one-to-one or Julie, we actually have some thought leadership around scenario planning and mapping and a few other of these in governance, so that, and how to apply innovation to mapping, because again, using your customer as your North Star allows you to envision a whole lot of different things. We have a client that AEG Live, they have a number of sports, they actually own Xanterra, so we moved over to their group to help them a little bit. But looking at the customer experience and understanding the customer needs and their best customer needs made them able to decide what facilities to build when they had new opportunities in different venues. So that's a pretty powerful thing to be able to do using this technology of experience mapping. So, understanding best practices, keeping a finger on the pulse of others is really interesting. Back in the day, I ran marketing at market management at Pac Bell, and one of the things we did, because we didn't have a research department that did this, is in every industry group, we picked our client that was the most bleeding edge avant-garde, and generally we couldn't serve them because they were so out there that, they were out there with all the little niche players of technology. But we watched what they did because we knew in 18 months that we would be expected to provide deliverables that look like theirs and services that look like theirs to the mass. So by just keeping a finger on the pulse of what they were doing, knowing that we had to be not so fast followers, allowed us to be able to be there and be there close enough to get the next wave of people who came in. And then, it allows you to ask the right questions. It allows you to uncover opportunities. And, it opens you up to some surprises and ahas, because there's tons of really interesting stuff out there that when you allow, especially when you allow your field-facing staff, you all know this, and your clients' field-facing staff to have ideas, That's where the magic really does happen. Some of the obstacles to being able to do what we're talking about, again, what we talked about here, I think this is kind of the reverse of the question you asked. Here's some of the things you don't want to do. Almost everybody, as I said, start with their outbound touches, and that's fine because we can throw them in a spreadsheet, load them up, and it's really a kind of a communications or a campaign plan. It kind of omits the whole concept. You've done hard work. You kind of understand if you've only looked at the data and response data and kept optimizing your outbound campaigns, that truly is sort of a look in the mirror of what a customer mission is, but it doesn't really, again, address if they're achieving their mission with the least amount of friction and the most amount of brand promise in there. So, make sure that even though you're starting from this, don't forget doing a little bit of outside in research enough to be able to really say that you understand what the customer's mission, and each customer, there's the customer journey to your point of the aggregate, and then there's the customer's journey. And even though most companies don't have the funds to do true one-to-one marketing, you can get really close. So you got to map it all. You got to map planned, you got to map unplanned, you've got to map inbound, outbound, and interactive so that you really understand the full picture. So siloed organizational alignment. Pretty much everybody has silos because every department comes to work trying to be innovative, and depending on their charter, now we've got a lot of departments, that really are channels. So you've got the social department, you've got the digital team. There's a huge push for digital transformation that leaves the call center, and if you have anything brick and mortar, or if you're B2B and you have inside sales and outside sales, so what do those people do in our new digital transformation? So, really understanding who is talking to your customer and what machines are talking to your customer. So, let's start mapping chatbots. It really helps you understand what's going on. Knowing where you want to go. So again, it's nothing more fun to us than to do a total greenfield map and just see what comes out. But that's for somebody who really is on a mission just to look. Let's go look around, poke in the corners, see what happens. Very few companies have the money nor the intention to do that. So if you don't have either a problem statement or a query that you kind of want to head towards, somewhat like that personality piece there, you're not going to get an actionable outcome. So you may wander upon some actionable outcomes, and even when you have an outcome that you want to do, you might find some others, but it's a lot easier, just like in any other scientific research, to kind of get an idea of what you want to do. So, mapping processes. This is something that companies deep in Six Sigma and get into. So there's a lot of process in the B2B world. There's a lot of process in automotive and telecom. They're just obsessed by process. And it's great, but if you forget the emotional inputs and that ethnographic research and voice of the customer, then again, you're not getting a full view, and oftentimes you get, so deep into fixing that particular little dot on the problem is that you forget the fact that you've got a customer base that's, may not care about that particular element as much as you do. So if you look at the cost to serve, and again, the tool will enable you to measure your cost to serve and your ROI on one stream, and then measure the ability to meet the customer mission on another. That's what you should be focusing on, because you can, again, get really deep after that. Well, thank you very much. We can share this actual deck with you if you'd like. We also have some webinars around CX governance and 360 customer experience, where you get data and how it helps. and scenario planning, which is the next one, of how to take your mapping up a level from looking at individual touches to looking at scenarios across time. Thank you very much.